But for more on the Shangri-La Dialogue, we are joined in studio by our China correspondent Olivia Seong once again, as well as our ASEAN correspondent Leong Wai Kit, as well as Mr. Choi Shing Kwok. Now, Mr. Choi is the director and CEO of Singapore-based research institution, IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. Well, warm welcome to each and every one of you. First question to you first. Mr. Choi, we heard Lauren's package there. She's talked a little bit about how the Shangri-La Dialogue has evolved over the years, but I want to hear your perspective on that. And I guess in a nutshell, what about its purpose and its role? Do you see that it's changed a little bit over the years, since the geopolitics is getting more and more unpredictable these days?
Yeah, well, first, thank you very much for having me. I think the Shangri-La Dialogue has indeed come a long way since its very beginning. It's grown both in terms of the size, as I think your correspondent mentioned, but also in terms of the level or stature. So clearly today, it is the most important defense and security conference for Asia, just as the Munich Security Conference is the one for Europe. You mentioned the purpose of the conference is really kind of like a gathering place, a kind of summit of sorts for Asian defense, Asia-Pacific defense ministers. This, I think, hasn't changed. Although, as your story has mentioned, that the theme has kind of naturally adapted with the changing times, focusing on various topics like terrorism, non-traditional security, tension in the South China Sea. And this, in the sense, kind of is natural. So it has to maintain its relevance by adapting to what are the topics of the period. On the sidelines, I think those closed-door meetings, I think that is a kind of a less talked about aspect of the Shangri-La Dialogue, but it's very important. And it's happening again this year.
Olivia, I want to bring you in here because when I was just asking you how many Shangri-La Dialogues you've been, you said you've lost count because you've been to so many.
Maybe my bad memory too, but
Maybe your bad memory as well. But so you have seen, for instance, situations where perhaps China has at times been critical of the gathering. You've witnessed frosty relations among these military top brass. Tell us more about your experiences covering the Shangri-La Dialogue all these years.
Well, I think it's been quite telling when at the closing session of one of the Shangri-La Dialogues, we heard from a Chinese delegate. He asked quite point blank whether some quarters who view this forum as being dominated by, and he asked whether this forum was serving the interest of the US and its allies. And that's because we know one of the main gripes from China is that the Shangri-La Dialogue can often be quite critical of its position. To which we heard from the Singapore Defense Minister answering that question, Dr. Ng Eng Hen, who said that China will need to decide for itself whether or not it is valuable for it to attend a dialogue like the Shangri-La Dialogue and for its voice to be heard there. But we have heard confirmation just today from China's Defense Ministry that the Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun will be attending this year. And in fact, in a report by the Communist Party-linked Global Times, it did say that this would be a good opportunity for China to express its standpoint and views, which includes its view that tensions in the region are caused by countries outside it. So possibly some tense exchanges to be expected when the event takes place this weekend. But we also know that in 2006, just 4 years after the Shangri-La Dialogue began, China also started what's known as the Xiangshan Forum in Beijing, and it's widely seen to be China's answer to rival the Shangri-La Dialogue. Having covered both events in the past, there are some differences. We do know, for example, when it comes to the makeup of the attendees, the US has never sent a ministerial level delegation to the Xiangshan Forum, whereas we have always seen, for most years, the US Defense Chief attend the Shangri-La Dialogue. Also at the Xiangshan Forum in Beijing, increasingly we see a lot of representation from developing countries, otherwise known as the Global South. Now, last year when I covered the event, we got to speak to Singapore's Defense Minister, and he was asked about this representation at the Xiangshan Forum and what he thought this all meant, and this is what he had to say.
The Shangri-La Dialogue was no different. It started not always with ministers attending, but now we have a good number of ministers, full ministers attending, and I expect the same will happen for Xiangshan Forum. But it also reflects, the Shangshan Forum attendance also reflects at a larger scale the disposition of the global architecture. Any serious analyst looking at global affairs will agree that much more needs to be done about the global south, about emerging economies, and there seems now to be a line between that and the developed US and Western Europe. That itself is a friction point, tectonic plate. If you don't pay attention to it, you will lose the global south if you've not already lost it. And I mean the developed countries. You will lose the emerging economies, and without their buy-in, without their cooperation, you won't be able to address the global challenges, not least climate change.
And Natalie, I think that it's something to watch as the Xiangshan Forum continues, the kind of level of representation that it has, whether the West chooses to send more high-level delegates to attend. But I also want to just ask Waikit here, you cover Southeast Asia extensively and reported on other platforms in which security issues are discussed. So how does this differ with the Shangri-La Dialogue?
Right. Ollie, I think by and large, the security concerns and issues would be by and large similar. What might be subtly different is perhaps the lens in which these platforms are viewed. So in the region that I cover, ASEAN, there are many structured and planned meetings, such as your ASEAN Regional Forum, which the grouping would meet with a dozen countries, including China, US, and North Korea. And of course, there's also the ASEAN Defence Ministers meetings once a year. They also meet with their +3 countries. And most recently, Vietnam started this ASEAN Future Forum. It's not built as a security conference. I attended that in Hanoi. But inevitably, you've got your geopolitical security topics being raised. But what stood out for me is that based on the panelists, the discussions, the topic, and the presence of attendees, it appears to me that it's very China-heavy, not so much US-heavy. And on that note, Mr. Choi, I want to bring you in for your views. I mean, there's so many varieties of these platforms with varying degrees of, being friendly to one superpower and less friendly to another superpower. So all these platforms, do they actually create more dialogue or division?
Well, I think that the Shangri-La Dialogue should not really be compared to these other emerging forums. I think the Shangri-La Dialogue itself does set out to bridge the gap between the different sides. So I think that what the organizers, the IISS, have done from the very beginning is try to be inclusive. And I think that's why they went out and invited China to participate from as early as they were comfortable to do so. They have also, I think, quite consciously given China a very prominent speaking slot so that China would be at the conference and will have enough airtime to make its case. And so it's very clear for anyone who attends the Shangri-La Dialogue that China's position in the dialogue is, in terms of priority, is second only to that of the US. Of course, the Chinese themselves may not feel as comfortable in Shangri-La as compared to other contexts, because those other contexts, it may be surrounded by more of its closer, friendly countries. The style of speaking in the Shangri-La Dialogue is also a little bit more Western in nature, in that it is more candid, it is more direct, whereas the Chinese may be used to and may also prefer a more sort of diplomatic and very indirect approach and tone. But notwithstanding this, I think that the Shangri-La Dialogue, because of its level, because of the organizers, because it is Singapore that is the host, they have made an effort. So in that sense, I would think that Shangri-La Dialogue maintains its utility above any other regional forums, for example, the ones that have been discussed earlier.
Also, Mr. Choi, you talked about getting enough airtime to be heard, whether language could possibly be an issue. I want to get your thoughts on in terms of the smaller countries, perhaps ASEAN countries. I was there last year and I've spoken to some of the smaller countries, and they said being heard is a bit of an issue. Like you kind of need sharp elbows and a loud voice to project their thoughts and their views at the Shangri-La Dialogue in order to advance their interests, especially when it's dominated by superpowers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that countries that want to have a bigger impact basically have to roll out people who are more senior. So this year, we're expecting the president from Philippines to do the keynote address. So if that's the case, he will certainly have a very good platform to make his views known. So this is one way in which countries that participate can actually get more airtime and also more limelight. Having said that, I think that the ASEAN countries from the Shangri-La Dialogues that I have attended, generally they do get speaking slots. It may be in a plenary where several speakers will make a case in a sort of a panel, one after the other. But that's also the case for some European countries as well. So the small countries in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, do get a chance to speak at the plenaries in Shangri-La Dialogue. And I think it's important they continue doing so because they do then make their positions known to the rest of the world, also to the major powers, the global powers that are present. And they also present this different perspective. This is, after all, a period when there's great competition and volatility between the great powers. And this has a very direct impact on all the smaller countries in Southeast Asia as well as the rest of the world.
Next question to both of you, Ollie and Waikit, and perhaps Waikit can take this one first. I'm just wondering how important is the Shangri-La Dialogue this year from the respective regions you're looking at, and what are some of the hot button issues that will be discussed? Kit?
Well, I think for ASEAN or ASEAN member states, it's very important for them to speak collectively as one voice, and for them to importantly, on such a big platform, to appear united rather than divided. Perhaps it's also a time for the bloc to remind the major powers that they do not want to be forced to choose sides. If we go to Myanmar, where I also cover, now Myanmar is not invited to the Shangri-La Dialogue, by the way, but there are sessions. There had also been sessions on Myanmar previously. So to Myanmar, it is perhaps one platform where the discussion is continued. Hopefully, discussions and contributions can move the needle on Myanmar. And in Malaysia, particularly in Johor, where I now also cover, and as Mr. Choi said earlier, the threat of terrorism, this has now resurfaced because of a recent attack in a police station in Johor Bahru. So this gives all these stakeholders a platform for them to come together to discuss ways forward. Ollie.
Yeah, I think also, Kit, one of the topics that both of us will have to cover is the South China Sea. As Mr. Choi talked about how Marcos is going to be giving the keynote address, we know that he is going to make Philippines' position known, and we know that they have become more assertive in their claims in the South China Sea, and there have been skirmishes with China and with China's defense minister in the room. How will China react? How will other claimant states react to that? That's something we're going to be looking out for. The Global Times, interestingly, upon confirmation of it, did say, confirmation of China's defense minister attending, did say in its article that while the Shangri-La Dialogue presents opportunities, it could also be a stage where Western countries used to launch, quote, malicious accusations against China, quoting local observers. And so we also know that the China-US relationship will be in key focus amid all the security challenges that are taking place, whether it's the South China Sea or with Taiwan. We'll also be looking out on the sidelines for whether the Chinese defense chief will meet the US defense chief.
That's always the one we're looking out
Lloyd
for.
Austin, because they didn't meet last year. Of course, it was a previous, different defense minister at that time, and it was a bit challenging at that time given the heightened tensions for them to meet. Also, then that Chinese defense minister faced sanctions from the US, making it difficult for them to meet. So whether they will meet this time, the Pentagon says it is expected to happen. So we'll be keeping a close eye out for that for sure.
Yeah, it's going to be a very busy weekend for you both. Just before we wrap up this discussion, Mr. Choi, I thought Perhaps a question to you about the Shangri-La Dialogue. It is a defense forum. Do you think that it is enough to remain as a defense forum? And perhaps how does it ensure that it continues to stay relevant for the next 21 years?
Well, I think that this is filling a gap that doesn't exist in terms of either track 1 or track 2 forums. So, so long as the organizer continues to play their part well, in terms of being inclusive, in terms of inviting the right people, and also maintaining the tone of the discussion, so that people who attend it find that it's useful, I expect it to remain as an important forum. It doesn't mean that the issues will stay static. I think that the issues can continually adapt. The fact that it is hosted in Singapore, as long as Singapore, is happy to host this, because it is a lot of work also for Singapore to be hosting such a large number of countries, as many as 50 in previous dialogues. And this means that there will be a lot of people who have to take care of the dignitaries that are visiting. So it is a combined effort, I think, by the organizers on the IISS as well as the Singapore Defence Authorities to make this forum successful, and also one that the participants are happy to come to. I can foresee that it would still be around because the world is getting more volatile and it is getting more dangerous. And so the defense ministers do need to meet. There are other forums where foreign ministers meet and so on. I think those do not need to come into the Shangri-La Dialogue. It should stay security focused, in my view.
All right, many thanks for your thoughts. Mr. Choi Shing-kwok from Singapore-based IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, and of course, CNA's China correspondent Olivia Seong and our ASEAN correspondent Leong Wai Kit. Thanks so very much for being in our studio today.